welcome to this Amsterdam Center for International Law ACIL lecture by Deval Desai, who's a lecturer in international economic law at the Edinburgh Law School. And he will present his project on reversing the gaze, building a theory of administrative state forms from the global south. And we'll talk a bit more about the broader project on reversing the gaze, in which he studies together with some other colleagues the politics of social scientific comparative methods as they are applied to political questions in Europe and the global south. The more specific gateway into that broader project that we chose, is by way of an article, or actually a book chapter that was very recently published on redefining vulnerability and state-society relationships during the COVID-19 crisis, where he also with other colleagues co-authored a chapter on the politics of social welfare funds in both India and Italy. It's a great text. It's a wonderful project that testifies to his interests, to your interests, Deval, on law and development and administrative law regulations, and also especially from a global south perspective. So I'm very excited to learn more about the project. I was already very excited to read the text, it's the same as I heard from other colleagues already. So it would be without further ado that I would want to thank you once more for accepting our invitation, and would invite you to now take the screen and present your project to us. Thank you so much. The screen is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I've never quite heard it phrased as being given the screen. I feel slightly directorial and a lot more creative than I have any right to, so I appreciate it. I just do want to thank Ingo, the center, all of you for being here. It is actually quite a privilege to be here with you for all of the sort of standard ritual reasons that one might articulate, but also for the very practical reason that this is the first time that I'm talking about this project with a group of international lawyers, and a group of international lawyers who, as I understand the work of the center, are interesting, creative, engaged, and sharply critical. So I'm ready for all of the interesting thoughts and slings and arrows that are going to come my way. I'm very enthusiastic for them. So today I'm just going to talk about the broader project which produced, the pilot work for which produced the paper that you read. So it's not really going to be about that piece specifically, but the broader project within which it's situated. And that is at the juncture of law and development, comparative law, administrative law, and sociology of the fiscal state, which all sounds very grand, but I'm not going to do justice to any one of those literatures at all. So this is going to be relatively amateurish, but hopefully with interesting, ragged edges. So at a very simple level, the specific project is a comparison of a particular phenomenon, unspent funds, in India and Italy. So it certainly isn't the most traditional international law topic that you might have. I hope that some of the things I have to say, particularly around the nature of the state and institutional design, might resonate. Or you might listen to it and think, well, what the heck is he on about? In which case, totally fine. Feel free to either slings and arrows, or we can chat about something else more interesting. I'm totally open. But I do think that it's going to be helpful to hear from you guys, especially as people thinking about the state as an institutional complex. And so I'm really kind of looking forward to your thoughts. So let me just get the slides up and running. There we go. Okay. So the sort of long and rather dull title for the presentation, with due regard to the Swiss who are providing generous funding for this project. I thought what I'd do is begin by, see if I get the slides working. Yeah. I'm going to spend most of my time setting out the empirical and the conceptual puzzle that I'm working with. So that are these social welfare funds that remain unspent. From that, I'm going to touch briefly on issues relating to moving theoretical accounts of those unspent funds from the south, from India, northwards to Italy. And I'm going to try and make that a little bit more concrete in closing by talking for just a minute or two about the case of Italy, which I also hope to develop through the project. So those last two parts are a lot more propositional and speculative. So I'll just sort of set out some intuitions and would really welcome your reactions to them. So the core part of the talk on large volumes of social welfare funds in India that remain unspent. So they're definitely in the tens, plausibly in the hundreds of billions of US dollars. So that's quite striking. And I'm asking why these funds, which are collected for the benefit of specific vulnerable groups, remain unspent, unstolen, or otherwise unappropriated. Now, a lot of the empirical information that I'm going to work through comes from some of the pilot work from last year. And I'll give some detail about this phenomenon, but also frame it a little bit differently than in the paper that you read. So I'm not going to be talking about it in the context of COVID or the coronavirus crisis and the reappropriation of those funds. Rather, I'm just going to make pretty simple points. Why and how is it possible to understand underspending as a political phenomenon and not only a technical problem? And then what might that tell us about the forms of the administrative state? So to begin with, I'll cover definitions. I'll talk about understanding underspending as a social and political phenomenon, and I'll think about what it might tell us about the administrative state. So that's sort of the structure of the main part of the talk. So what am I talking about when I talk about unspent funds? Let me give an example from a fund that I've been studying for a couple of years and that makes an appearance in the chapter. So these are district mineral foundations, mandated by some sort of omnibus 2015 piece of legislation to reform the mining sector, and within it, a series of provisions concerned with the welfare of mining-affected communities. So the money is collected through hypothecated taxation. 10% of the royalties that mining companies pay to the government are held to benefit those communities. And the monies are deposited in district-level foundations, which are sui generis special purpose vehicles, whose legal form actually ends up varying a lot from district to district. They're often constituted as trusts, but can be as bare as depositing the money that's collected from taxation directly into a bank account that has been established, or even the personal bank account of a local level functionary. So the forms vary greatly. The money is supposed to be spent for any benefit, short or long term, to the community. And prior to the pandemic, $5 billion had been collected, $1.7 billion, $5 billion collected, $1.7 billion spent. So $3.3 billion sitting unspent. So it turns out that this sort of phenomenon is not at all unusual in India. Just by scratching the surface, you can find tax collected and placed in a special purpose vehicle for everything from the welfare of laborers in different sectors, to those affected by environmental and social harms from resource extraction, to those affected by natural disasters, to victims of sexual abuse, and so on. In terms of scale, by one measure, hypothecated taxation for social purposes is around 10% of gross taxation at the federal level. And that doesn't even include all of the state and local level taxation, nor non-legislative appropriation. So, as I mentioned, anecdotally, tens of billions of dollars lying around. But it turns out there are massive empirical challenges in getting a sense of the scale of this phenomenon. It's because it happens at a diversity of scales. So the funds can be gathered at the central level, also at the subnational state level, at the local level, municipal levels, and so on. They're also gathered via different taxation powers. So yes, funds are gathered through legislative appropriation at these different levels, but there are also major judicially mandated funds from the central judiciary, but also the state level judiciaries. And there's some that look quite a lot like executive taking. So it's not as if you can comb through the legislative and regulatory texts to find the funds. You'll be missing out on a big chunk of them from these other forms of appropriation. So you might think, well, okay, fine, let's just go and look at the special purpose vehicles and see if we can find them on a register. Turns out they're hugely diverse: corporations, trusts, foundations, charities, plain bank accounts, and so on. So there's no central repository there. And then finally, there are major audit limitations as well. So public audits, by their own admission, only capture a small percentage of the discrete funds and the money within them. So you can't just look at the audit reports. So what, if anything, does the existence of these funds, plus the challenge of understanding them as a phenomenon, tell us about state administration? That's sort of the question underlying the research. So this slide is just giving you a little bit about the working definition of the universe of funds that I'm trying to look at. I'm not going to go through it. Let me just summarize 3 key points. First, these funds tackle some sort of social vulnerability. This is important as a substantive matter, but is also a way of describing a particular orientation of social governance in India following the liberalization of the economy in 1991. And in essence, this reflects vulnerability as some sort of key problematic of state-society relations. Second, very simple point, the funds roll over, so they can't be reabsorbed into budgets. That's what helps them accumulate over and over and over. And third, the rolling over of funds is enabled because the funds are held apart from budgets in special purpose vehicles. Now, these SPVs tend to be complex institutional arrangements that link private organizational forms, usually, with administrative purpose and oversight. So boards, mineral foundations, development corporations, and so on. Importantly, these SPVs solely exist for the purpose of holding the funds and spending them to tackle that vulnerability. These are not multi-purpose funds within which the money goes in. They're single purpose. So the kind of conceptual challenge, how to understand this as a socio-political issue. On one level, this is a pretty mundane policy problem. There are quite a few possible causes of unspent funds from academic and policy research that are listed here. I'm not going to work my way through them. The point that I want to raise from this is that they're generally technical. State capacity, bureaucratic capacity, awareness, that sort of thing. Why? Well, so my suspicion on working through both the grey literature and some of the academic literature is that it has something to do with the way in which we conceptualize the fiscal activities of so-called modern states. So whether these states are in Europe or beyond, the politics of the state fisc are found in the politics of collecting money and spending money, revenue collection and expenditure. So states might have reasons or imperatives to raise revenue, often in the literature articulated as needing money for war, expansion, stability. And they also have imperatives to expend, welfare being a classic one, maybe in response to a legitimation crisis, and so on. So collection and expenditure are objects of political study. And between the two are institutions with, in Schumpeter's term, machine manner. In other words, we hear the metaphors of conduits, channels, and the like that are understood in terms of their ability to transmit money from collection to expenditure. So to put it simply, decisions to tax, decisions to spend, and active decisions not to spend are political and social phenomena. So it might be the choice of one policy priority over another. But persistent underspending across the board is understood as a technical problem, rooted in the idea that dead public money is anathema to state administration. So just take the development literature on budgetary underspending. It's really managerial in the sense that it tends to relate causes of underspending to fiscal absorptive capacity. Can the state collect, hold, manage, move around money? And bureaucratic capacity. Can the state transform that money into projects, programs, and so on? And this is then capacity that can be built through, for example, technical assistance programs. To the extent that this literature thinks about political causes for underspending, they're relevant insofar as they interfere with those capacities. So political will might be required to build the bureaucratic capacity to spend or to tackle a particular blockage within the system. Or a lack of bureaucratic capacity to spend might reflect a political strategy to paralyze the administrative state in favor of private service provision, the solution to which is to change political incentives in order to develop the right bureaucratic capacity. The institutional specificities of these funds, the nature of the SPVs, the institutional context, similarly understood in terms of facilitating or interfering with those capacities, fiscal and bureaucratic. So I'm trying to make the case not only that unspent funds can be understood as more than this, as a distinctive political, social, institutional phenomenon in their own right, but also that they should be understood as more than this. And to do that, I'm going to dive into a little more detail into a different example case, which was a subject of a fair bit of the pilot work and that's mentioned in the chapter. And that's the Building and Other Construction Workers Cess Fund, which the BOCW for sake of brevity. So there's enabling legislation in 1996 at the national level in India, which identifies construction workers as a particular vulnerable social group. So their numbers at this point in time have increased manifold due to the boom in the Indian construction sector following liberalization in 91. They also remain outside the purview of de jure and de facto labor protection. So they're mainly unorganized sector workers. Their number is contested, but generally accepted approximations put them at about 42 million. So, reasonably substantial. So the BOCW raises funds for them through a 1% tax on the cost of construction over a certain size. And this is paid for by the capitalist, builder, property developer, to the relevant state government. So this is at the subnational level. Collection is state by state through its usual taxation process, and actually reasonably effective when and only when construction of the relevant size is reported. And as you can imagine, there are significant allegations of underreporting, which social movements have focused on. Money is then held by an SPV in each Indian state, keeping it independent of budget lines. And that SPV is the BOCW board. So this is constituted as a body corporate, and this is the only other requirement in the legislation. It has to be governed by an equal number of members representing the state government, the subnational government, the employers, and the building workers. Other than that, each state develops as it sees fit its own implementing rules, the structure of its board, subject to those conditions. And so some of them have very complex structures on paper, advisory committees, technical committees, and so on. And each state also constitutes the fund where the monies are deposited and that the board oversees. Construction workers have to pay a small fee to register with the board to be eligible for benefits. This will become relevant in a moment. And under registration is pretty endemic. So spending is at the discretion of the board and its functionaries, and can be for a whole range of purposes, from medical care to childcare, to pensions many years in the future, to cash transfers tomorrow. So expenditure is not only diverse, but the time horizon for spending is pretty indeterminate. Now, by 2018, around a quarter of collected monies had been spent. And by 2019, around $4.25 billion remained unspent. Much of it simply pooled as cash in sort of various places. And as the public auditor eventually noted, much of it was pooling in non-interest bearing accounts. So this is about as dead money can be. So it's clear from the case that quite a range of those technical explanations that I mentioned earlier pertain. Low capacity to enroll beneficiaries, low bureaucratic capacity to develop programs, and so on. But it seems to me that if we dig a little deeper, we might be able to think of the underspending of BOCW funds in a political fashion. And to do that, we're going to start with accountability for underspending and a couple of court cases. So the BOCW is quite unusual in that it's one of the funds where underspending has been litigated. And there are a couple of cases in particular. One is actually a series of cases from 2016 to 2018 that ended up in the Supreme Court, brought by a group of NGOs and trade unions going under the banner of the NCCCL. And they sought compulsion to spend through a range of administrative and rights-based arguments that non-spending essentially defeated the purpose of the legislation. Now, importantly for my argument, here, the federal government claimed that the institutional structure of the BOCW was just too complex for it to ensure spending. It had tried and tried, it said, to get each state to constitute boards and spend monies, but to no avail. The states, the subnational governments, in turn argued that it was really difficult for them to work out how to reconcile putting together the boards with their existing administrative structures. So who from the administration, the state level administration, should sit on the board? Should it be labor functionaries, they asked, Or since the board might provide healthcare or pensions, should it be people from those ministries? In what capacity would they sit? And on what basis might they make decisions? Since, as they argued, even the public auditor didn't have all the figures about the number of people registered or how much money should in fact be in the boards. And they said whatever figures are available may not be reliable. So there was this back and forth through the case between the central government and the state governments, both of them proclaiming that they were just too overwhelmed by the complexity of the endeavor to set up the boards properly and spend the money. So importantly, this isn't a story about a stitch-up where the state government, central government, and employers colluded to pack membership of the board and then divert funds in the way they wanted. Indeed, in some of our initial discussions with state functionaries, a few of them intimated that they didn't actually want to be on the boards altogether. And if they were, that they were really wary of spending money precisely because they didn't want to be accused by social movements or in the press of corruption or stitch-ups or self-dealing. Instead, they were arguing that they cannot be held responsible or accountable for non-spending owing to decentralization, the fragmentation of administrative authority, and lack of clarity on whether and how administrative bodies had oversight of the SPVs. Now, a couple of years later, in 2020, just before the pandemic, a different case hit the Supreme Court called Kesalal, and there the plaintiff used consumer protection legislation to sue for dispersal of funds. Here, the plaintiff argued that the BOCW registration fees, remember, it's a small registration fee, usually 25 to 50 rupees, was a contribution for a service giving rise to a consumer contract, that service being some set of dispersal of the funds. Now, again, relevant for my argument here, both the central state and the subnational governments argued that the boards are in fact welfare providers. They cannot be understood as private service providers. The state explicitly argued that the boards are part of state administration and executed a sovereign function. So between these two cases, you can see the public authorities arguing that the BOCW is capable of being and is not capable of being subject to administrative oversight. So subsequently, COVID-19 hit, and as you saw in the chapter, in March 2020, the central government announced a $22.5 billion financial aid package for the poor and vulnerable. So about 800 million people were eligible. And the central government lent directly on the subnational governments and often directly on the boards to disperse their unspent corpus directly to beneficiaries and often to non-beneficiaries, to people in general, as immediate cash transfers. And this emergency reappropriation amounted to almost 20% of that overall package. So here, the state's exercising its taxation power with some degree of effectiveness to raise money. It's then not spending that money. It's avoiding accountability for not spending by claiming weakness and putting up for question the nature and extent of public oversight of the funds. And then, under certain conditions, reappropriating these pools of liquidity. And I'm suggesting that we might want to understand this dynamic of collecting, underspending, weak accountability, and reappropriation as some sort of discrete political phenomenon. But it turns out that doing so is not all that easy. So, as I've already belabored, non-spending doesn't really seem to have a political life in the literature. And this idea seems to be baked not just into our ways of thinking about public finances, but also their institutional structures. So, for example, the Public Auditor of India notes that the central government frequently, quote, short transfers collected special purpose funds. So the money is collected centrally or at the subnational level. It's supposed to briefly sit in government coffers, earmarked, and then transferred directly to the special purpose vehicle. The short transfer is where only part of the money is transferred into the special purpose vehicle, and the rest of the money just sits dead in the government accounts. And across a series of special purpose funds, the public auditor noted around $14 billion in 2019 just remained in the central government accounts. Now, separately and completely distinctly, the public auditor noted that the special purpose vehicle underspent even that reduced amount. But these two things are understood as completely distinct phenomena. But if you frame it a little bit differently, the sort of short transfer, keeping it in the public accounts, and then short spending, not spending what's in the SPV, together could be understood as creating specific, provisional, maybe fluid pools of persistent financial liquidity. And there's quite a lot at stake in where they pool, how they pool, and for how long they pool. So you've seen how this helped the central state at the onset of COVID in terms of emergency relief, these pools of liquidity. They can be politically potent in other ways too. These pools, there's some anecdotal evidence that MPs in one Indian state lent on district mineral foundations in their area to withhold spending until close to election time. Now, I should note here that this claim that unspent funds are political phenomena in their own right doesn't require the possibility that they might be reappropriated in the future, because that would just reproduce the notion that funds should be spent, that dead funds aren't interesting in and of their own right, and that studies should look at the alignment of political incentives that leads to their release. So I'm not making that argument. Instead, I'm arguing that underspending can be politically salient even without assuming that money will eventually be appropriated. So I'm talking about reappropriation as a way of bringing the politics of underspending to light, rather than arguing that it should be folded into the politics of collection or expenditure. So in any event, if the tools that we have sort of downplay underspending as a distinctive phenomenon, what different analytical tools might we develop? So I'm just going to give you two initial moves that I'm working with quickly. The first is non-spending as an example of a particular account of the Indian state. And this draws on Randerya's notion of the Indian state as a cunning state. And I'll come to why I draw on this concept a little later. So Randeria is a post-colonial theorist and anthropologist who born in India, and she built this notion out between 2003 and 2007. And it's a notion in the context of states with some degree of administrative capacity. So this is distinct from weak states, where she says they are unable to discharge their obligations of justice. Instead, cunning states are in a position to negotiate the terms on which they share or cede sovereignty in certain fields of policymaking while retaining control over others. So this is about having the capacity to execute or step back from administrative activities. So for Randeria, the cunning state on one level describes state tactics within the administrative domain. So cunning states play on their perceived weakness to justify a partial and selective implementation of policies, projects, and programs. This leads her to the intuition that if welfare states redistribute risk and resources, cunning states redistribute responsibility for administrative activity. That's sort of the institutional logic of the cunning state. And they do so through accountability mechanisms for this administrative activity. That's her other insight, that accountability mechanisms are key. They're the central domain on which cunning states emerge and operate. So we have in Randeria's story a set of political tactics that occur within and emerge from a particular set of administrative institutional arrangements. So translating this to my case of non-spending, we might see the state exercising its power to collect funds, but denying its power to spend and meet obligations. And we can also see the institutional arrangements that enable this. Weak accountability for non-spending, and when accountability is attempted, claims about institutional fragmentation and weakness, for example, in the NCCCL case. So this will be non-spending as an example of the institutional form of the cunning state. But I do think that it's possible to make a stronger argument, which is that unspent funds are not just an example of, but central to the form of the cunning state. So here I'm making particular use of fiscal sociology and theories of the fiscal state, which understand public finances as a central domain of political and social contestation. So the public finances here are generative of the form of the administrative state. The budget reflects and generates the skeleton of the state, stripped of all ideology in Schumpeter's terms. I'm happy to go into more detail about the strands I'm working with, but here I just want to set out the limited way, a very limited way that I'm using it, which is to say that as both a historicized and decontextualized claim, the need to tax and spend is generative of the institutional forms of the administrative state in really important ways. This state is concerned with the production and reworking of public and private and state and society through its administrative activities relating to taxation and expenditure. So putting these together, following the non-spending of funds might be a privileged site that shows us the institutional forms of the cunning state. For example, it might be some particular combination of institutional fragmentation, the blurring of public and private, as we saw in those two cases, weak accountability, and the enduring capacity to tax. All of those might describe an administrative state form at some level. So the idea would be that studying the non-spending of finances and their institutional conditions and effects might mean that we can develop an account of the institutional form of the cunning state. Now, this account is clearly built from the Indian context, but it is still empirically and conceptually entangled in some ways across North and South. So that original notion of the cunning state, for example, works with and against an idea about the modern state as an enterprise that seeks to expand control or pursue efficiency. The cunning state, Randeria developed it with a view to try and contest the idea of India as a weak state, and more broadly to push against literatures that divided states into strong and weak categories in the context of their ability to live up to whatever your given flavor of stateness might be. So in this case, in my case, it's fiscal capacity. So rather than being a weak state, states like India and other states often found in the South in the literature might play with and rework these ideas about strength and weakness in the context of globalization. So that's sort of Randeria's move, and you can see the entanglements across North and South there. Moreover, the specific ideas about the state being reworked in my case studies come from theories of the fiscal state and methods of fiscal sociology, which have a really clear European inheritance. So these literatures focus on the economic history of Europe in the main, although there are some comparative histories that situate themselves in Asia in particular. And they also focus on the importance of the emergence of the state as an impersonal revenue management mechanism that can operate across space and time, and is as a result deeply implicated in the projection of colonial administrative control. So the relevance of talking about the southernness or not of this concept of the cunning state emerges in the context of the broader project. And so I realize I probably only have about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to turn briefly to that project and then hand it over to the discussion. So the project is called Reversing the Gaze, and it's a consortium between Edinburgh, Zurich, and Basel. It'll run till the end of 2024. And as an important positionality claim, the team at Edinburgh includes people based here in Geneva and in Bangalore. And we're a pretty north-heavy, north-south collaboration for the strand working on the cunning state. We're majority female in early career, with a preponderance of Indian researchers, along with a smaller team of Italian researchers. Now, the broader project's concerned with taking mid-level concepts about governance developed in the Global South and applying them to Europe. So we have retribalization, which is used to think about Swiss responses to non-white immigration, Chatterjee's political society, used to think about hard right-wing populism in Austria, and then here the cunning state, used to think about the administrative state in Italy in the context of the EU. And so the project's thinking about what happens to these concepts as they're decontextualized from their southern roots and then recontextualized in Europe. What explanatory purchase do they have? And to what extent is that purchase related to enduring northern conceptual categories? And if so, so what? So in my case, I'm exploring whether the cunning state can be understood as an account of a state form that can then also explain and be further developed by applying it to Italy. So does that work? Does that just end up reproducing existing, often northern-oriented theories of the fiscal state? Or do I end up saying not very much at all, either because the cunning state has little relevance to Italy or because I've just theorized it really badly? So the project has a lot of presuppositions, but let me just highlight two that I think are important for today. So presupposition one, the entanglement of the North and South, not only at an empirical level, but also as at a conceptual level. To put it another way, it's not clear whether, or more accurately, what sort of comparison might be possible from South to North, and why exactly it would be useful. And that's because the project foregrounds and problematizes the nature of the comparative third, the tertia, or the sort of general concept that's enabling the comparison. So for example, I'm comparing India and Italy by thinking about the cunning state as an iteration of the broader concept of the fiscal or administrative state. My colleague in Zurich is thinking about political society as an iteration of populism. The comparison that we're making from South to North is an effort to try and problematize those thirds and asking, is that concept meaningfully universal, or can it be made so? Or are we showing it to be contingent, such that the things being compared can't be squeezed into the same frame? Or is that third, in fact, entangled, such that the cases are too endogenous to be compared? Now, we could pursue this in a few ways, right? So we could work from the presumption that the concept could be refined, and that comparison from the South is in the service of that. So this would entail some belief in the possibility of conceptual refinement, or in slightly blunter terms, the possibility of separating the scientific value of comparison from its political baggage, as long as the comparison's done right in some way. Alternatively, we could do something pretty similar, pursue the comparison, but with a view to heightening the contradictions in the process of comparison. bringing out the relentlessly Eurocentric comparative thirds, and showing that doing comparison from the South is necessarily a political matter in the sense of having to contest power and social structures around what constitutes a meaningful comparison. Or we could use the comparison as a springboard for further empirical and conceptual work, in the sense of seeing these thirds as an effect of historical and conceptual entanglements across North and South. So we might work on new conceptual genealogies of the fiscal state, developing new archives of that idea, drawing on what Chakrabarty would call an Indian social science, and then trying to put those on equal footing to other, perhaps more Eurocentrically, European-derived concepts of the fiscal state. Or this could entail studying how the fiscal state was made in its empirical and historical interactions between Britain and India. For example, there's work on how pension funds in the Madras Presidency in South India in the 19th century were an experimental site for the eventual institutional arrangements of the British welfare state. To be that sort of work. Now, these are not in any way exclusive or exhaustive options, and I'm sure other possibilities might come up over the years of the project. But the reason I raise them is that they do seem to reflect really distinct political commitments. For example, to conceptualism or even idealism, to empiricism, to practical politics. So it's going to be important to track how and why these comparisons are made. And that brings me to the second presumption of the project, that very simply, comparison is a contextual practice. That's something that we're presuming. It's something that we do in a situated, historical, and sociological fashion. So we'll be tracking the process, the decisions, and the ad hoc or contingent bits as well. So for example, right now, studying empirical entanglements is pretty hard to imagine because of what's happening in India and the challenges of doing field work there right now. So it goes without saying that this is pretty experimental. At the very least, our efforts to move concepts in this way will produce conceptual irritation, or maybe all sorts of irritation, but hopefully there'll be value in the process, whether we succeed or whether we fail. Let me just take 1 minute, because it will only be 1 minute, on India to Italy, and then I'll cut it there. So my gaze reversal is from India to Italy. I'm going to see what happens when I map the account of the cunning state from India onto European social funds in Italy. So we're in even earlier stages. We've done some really useful pilot work in Basilicata, and there's some detail on this slide and the next, giving some of my initial understanding of the Italian case, but I'm really not going to go into it here, just that there are a couple of key points. One is that the Italian case is structurally very different to India in a lot of ways. In particular, the funds are lapsable. They use it or lose it. There's a lapsable budget cycle of somewhere between 7 and 9 years. There's also a co-financing requirement of between 5 and 50% of monies. That co-financing can be public, private, or some mix. There are also some really important similarities, especially that the funds are about the governance of particular vulnerabilities in the context of single market integration, that there are very low levels of spending. Italy is persistently one of the lowest in the EU. There's high levels of institutional fragmentation, major challenges in ensuring and compelling spending, and significant instances of state reappropriation of funds. So more generally, I'm still developing the cases. This is going to be a really inductive theory building process. So the cases are sort of intended to give us the best chance to develop a thick account of the institutions that might enable the sort of politics of buck passing that I'm talking about. But hopefully, more generally, this is the sort of project that could benefit from, but also facilitate further conversations across spaces, disciplines, ideas, people. And those are the things that I'm really looking forward to, along with your questions. So thank you.